Hi, my name is Janet Winkle from astampineveryhand.com, and I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about the question that most people ask me, and that is, what ink do I use? What is the difference between a dye base and a pigment ink? And when do I use a permanent or solvent ink? So people are really confused when they walk into a scrapbook store or a rubber stamp store and they see all these different kinds of inks. So today I'm going to try to answer some of your questions, and we'll start with what ink do I use. So if you're stamping and you're going to color with a colored pencil, you're going to use a dye base ink or a permanent ink. So the most common dye base inks would be Memories by Stewart or Marvies or Adirondack. Adirondack is available just about everywhere. Memories is one of my favorite. This is Memento and this one's Memories. And then you also have the Tim Holtz dye base inks. So there's all different kinds of dye base inks if you're coloring with just colored pencils like Prismacolor or some of the other color pencils on the market. Now if you're going to be using a watercolor pencil, then these inks are not going to work for that. So you're going to have to go to a solvent ink or a permanent ink like StazOn. This you can use with any watercolor technique. That includes watercolor pencils or dye-based markers like Marvy or Tombow, which happens to be one of my favorites. So if you're going to color with these things, then you need to stay with a solvent or a permanent ink, because these are all water-based and this has a solvent in it. So you're not going to be pulling out your ink when you go to color. Now there are so many other different kinds of inks. These are the two most commonly used, which would be dye base, and it's going to say dye base on the package, or a solvent or a permanent ink, and it's going to say solvent on there. So those are your most common inks that you're going to be using. The next thing people want to know about is pigment inks, and what do I stamp and heat emboss with. Those would be either a pigment ink or a ink that says embossing fluid ink on it. These are wetter inks. They're going to stay wetter longer. They allow you to add your powder, and they allow you to heat emboss. Now I know a lot of people use Versamark for heat embossing. That's not what it was designed for. Versamark is an ink that you can leave a watermark on your paper, which gives you a little bit of a shadow or a shading of whatever you stamp on your paper. You can use it to emboss, but the best product for embossing would be either a pigment, and pigment comes in all different colors. Most of your metallic inks are going to be pigment, or a ink that is designed for embossing, and that would be an embossing ink. So I hope that helps you with that. And there are other brands of, there's Brilliance, which is another one that's really readily available. There's another ink called chalk ink. This kind of gives you that chalky effect when you stamp with it. It's a little bit wetter ink. I have never tried to emboss with it. I guess it's possible that you could, but it's kind of a chalky color. It's not a shiny color when you stamp it. So that's another ink that's out there. You can also find inks in multicolored pads like this. Now these are good to use with brayers, but these are a dye-based ink too. So you've got to realize that when you're working with this, you cannot use a liquid type ink. Now there's another question as far as inks are concerned, and that's, what do I use when I'm coloring with my Copic or alcohol ink markers? And you want to use Memento. This is the most recommended ink, and it comes in all different colors. It is a dye-base ink, but it has a tiny bit of solvent in it, which allows you to stamp and color with the alcohol ink markers. Now, the other inks, they don't work as well. You'll pull out the color. So you want to remember that whenever you're doing your alcohol ink markers or Copic markers, you want to use Memento ink. Okay, now there's one more ink out there that is kind of confusing to a lot of people, and it's called the Resist ink. I use this mainly when I'm stamping on glossy paper, and once I stamp it, I heat set it. Then I can brayer color over the top of that, and wherever that ink is, it's going to resist it. So it's going to shine through the white of the glossy paper once I've colored it over. Okay, we've covered what ink do I use, what are the different types of ink between dye and permanent, or dye and pigment, and we've covered the permanent. If you're wanting to know more about inks and how I use them, you might want to check out my website. And this is the first DVD I ever made, which is Rubber Stamping Basic Tips and Techniques. And then I also am well known for Stampscapes, Brayers, and beyond. So if you'd like to learn how to do these beautiful stamped images and how to color them and the different inks that I use, this is another good way for you to get more familiar with different kinds of inks. So check those out at my website, astampineveryhand.com. And again, my name is Janet Winkle, and I hope I've answered some of your questions about inks. And look for more videos from me in the future. And check out my website, astampineveryhand.com.